So we're going to look at the college football playoff rankings. They had came out yesterday, and I was actually watching it, and I was like, there is no possible way that I'm really looking at what I'm looking at. So we're going to just look at the top 8 teams. We're going to look at the top 8 teams because those teams are the 8 teams that can potentially, if they win, they can make the college football playoffs. So you have Georgia at number 1. You have Georgia at number 1. You have Michigan at number 2, which after the W, they had to go to number 2 because Ohio State was number 2. You have Washington at 3. You have Florida State at 4. Oregon at 5. Ohio State drops to 6. You have Texas at 7, and you have Alabama at 8. I feel like Ohio State should not be at 6, and I'm going to tell you why. All of these teams, except for Ohio State, are playing for a championship. They're playing for something that if they win, they can potentially make it to the college football playoffs. So with that in mind, how can Ohio State be ranked ahead of Texas or Alabama and they're not playing for nothing? It doesn't make no sense. Each and every one of those teams are playing for something. If they win, they control their own destiny. Or some of them, if they do win, they got to get some help to make it to the college football playoffs. So when we're looking at the college football playoffs, another thing, are we going to look at the college football playoffs? The committee says the 4 best teams. Are we going to look at the college football playoffs for the 4 best teams, or are we going to look at it for the 4 most deserving teams? You tell me. You tell me, because if we want to have the 4 best teams, I can guarantee you that Washington is not a 4 best team. Florida State with Jordan Travis and how they played against Florida, which in that game, Florida was beating Florida State all the way until 7 minutes and 32 seconds in the fourth quarter. And they were up 12-0 against them. And it felt as though Florida State was finna get boat race if they didn't really get it together. They don't look like a top 4 team without Jordan Travis. They just don't. So you can't put them at number 4. Yes, they're undefeated. But if we're looking at the best teams, I feel as though Florida State will lose to Ohio State. I feel like they'll lose to Oregon. I feel like they'll lose to Texas. And I feel like they'll lose to Alabama. Because Florida State, they don't have Jordan Travis. It's the 4 best teams. It's not the deserving teams. And even with Washington, I feel like Washington will lose to Texas. I feel like Washington will lose to Alabama. I feel like they'll lose to Oregon. I feel like they'll lose to an Ohio State. We're not trying to have a college football playoff like last year or years in the past to where a number 1 seed is significantly better than a number 4 seed, or a number 1 seed is better than a number 3 seed. We don't need to have a Georgia versus a TCU in a 63-7 shellacking where we just sit here to ourselves and we're like, dang, should TCU make it to the college football playoffs? Should they have been in? When the crazy thing was, they lost in the championship. They lost in the Big 12 championship to Kansas State. You want to know who was 5? Alabama. Do you want to know who TCU played in the championship? Kansas State. Do you want to know who Alabama played in the Sugar Bowl? Kansas State. What happened? One lost, TCU, and they still made it because of the deserving factor of it. And then you have Alabama that comes out and literally blows out Kansas State. So it's like we know that Alabama is better than Florida State. We know that Texas is better than Florida State. They don't have Jordan Travis. We know that both of those teams are better than Washington. So if we're going to do the 4 best teams, if we're going to say that the committee is trying to put in the 4 best teams, it has to be Georgia, Michigan, Texas, and Alabama. Those, in my opinion, are the 4 best teams, and I'm going to tell you why. Oregon at 5, I feel like Oregon has Bo Nix, and the crazy thing about it, Bo Nix is fixing to win the Heisman, and I absolutely do not love that Bo Nix is going to win the Heisman, and I'm going to tell you why. Bo Nix started off at Auburn. Nothing went well for him too much at Auburn. It was very underwhelming at Auburn. He goes to Oregon. Now, we know the Pac-12 defenses is not that good. We all know that the Pac-12 is not that good. So when Oregon comes and plays Georgia's first game of the season, he got absolutely destroyed. Got absolutely destroyed by Georgia. But he's the leading candidate for the Heisman Trophy. You have Jaden Daniels, which if it wasn't for his defense letting him down and allowing all of these points, he has better stats than Joe Burrow. He should be the one that's winning the Heisman if it wasn't for his defense. But we have Bo Nix fixing to be the Heisman Trophy winner. With that being said, Oregon played Texas Tech, and they almost lost. They literally almost lost that game. Yes, it was on the road, but Texas Tech is still Texas Tech. And you're the number 5 ranked team in the country. Texas played Texas Tech last week, and they got absolutely destroyed. Texas blew out Texas Tech by over 50 points. So if we go based off of common opponent, Texas Tech got blitzed by over 50, and then you have Oregon that won by 1 score. So with that in mind, Texas is a better team than Oregon, because the same people that don't want to say that are going to be the same people that say if Georgia beats Alabama, then Texas should be in because Texas beat Alabama, Alabama beat Georgia, so that means that Texas is better than all of them. You have to put it both ways. So I wouldn't be surprised if y'all do say that Texas, if they do win and Florida State loses, then they're in, or somehow, some way that they are in. But I really do feel as though SEC ball is just different from Pac-12. I feel as though that it's different from Pac-12, and I feel like it's different from ACC. Florida State is not a good team without Jordan Travis. He's not a good team. It's not the same team, and you clearly saw it in the Florida game. Literally, Tate Rodemaker, 12 of 25, 134 yards. Mind you, like I had told y'all, they didn't lead the game until 7 minutes and 32 seconds in the fourth quarter. So Florida, if it wasn't for them not being disciplined towards the end of the game, they could have easily won the game. So Florida State, that doesn't make them, when you look at the eye test, they don't make them one of the 4 best teams in the nation. It just doesn't. Georgia, I can give you Georgia. Georgia, they haven't lost in over 2 years. They've been running through every single team. I can give you that. Michigan, I feel as though they have the biggest win as of right now in the nation with them beating Ohio State. So, yes, they have to be in it. Those 2 teams, if they win, then they're in. That's just a lot. It's just interesting with Washington and Florida, how you're going to play that off. Do you truly believe that if Florida State does win, but Texas wins too, do you feel as though Florida State should somehow, some way be out of it? Or do you feel as though if Georgia loses to Alabama, because if Georgia loses to Alabama, how is that going to work out? Would you put a 1-loss Georgia who hasn't lost in over 2 years, and this is going to be their first loss, would you keep them in the college football playoffs? Would you have them be at like 4, or would you drop them completely out, put Alabama in, or would you put Texas in? Would you take out Florida State because of the simple fact that Alabama beat Georgia? Like, this whole thing can be chaotic quick. This is probably the year of, this could potentially be the most chaotic. This could be the most chaotic championship week that we have ever seen with the college football playoffs. Because none of these games, except for the Michigan-Iowa game, is easy, should I say. And even with that game, it's not easy. Georgia can easily lose to Alabama because Alabama has beat Georgia. They were the last team to beat them. Washington can easily lose to Oregon, in which I honestly believe that Oregon can beat Washington, because in that game, Oregon, if it wasn't for that miss to take it to overtime, they could have won that game. And they're on paper and by the eye test, they're a better team than Washington, especially now, because ever since that game, they've been beating teams. And I personally believe that Oregon is going to beat Washington. this rematch, they're gonna beat them. Florida State, it's not easy because they don't have Jordan Travis. Yes, Louisville lost to Kentucky, but those teams, like it's just, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's just an easy cakewalk against Louisville. Even though Louisville hasn't played nobody for real and they just lost to Kentucky last week, I don't feel as though it's gonna be a real cakewalk. So this college football playoffs can be real deal crazy. If I had to pick my teams, if I had to personally pick my teams on who I think will make it, I honestly believe Michigan is going to beat Iowa. Michigan's going to beat Iowa, so they're automatically in. That's one. You have Oregon at 5. They're going to beat number 3 Washington. So I feel like if they win, I feel as though they should be in. Florida State, even though they're undefeated, even if they beat Louisville, I don't feel as though that they are a lock to make it in the college football playoffs because of the simple fact. If Alabama beats Georgia, like I told y'all earlier in this podcast, you have Alabama can potentially make the playoffs. And if Texas wins against if Texas wins against Oklahoma State, they can potentially make the college football playoffs. So it's like Florida State, I don't know. So Michigan, Oregon, I feel like Texas should be in if Alabama and they win. And I feel like Alabama should be that 4th team. They should be that 4th team. The reason why is because Texas beat Alabama. Yes, they're a different team, but you have to put head to head in the category, and consider that. Because if Texas somehow doesn't make it, even if they win, we're going to look at the college football playoffs and be like, head to head doesn't matter. We kind of already look at it right now as common opponents don't matter because of the simple fact Oregon is ahead of Texas, and they both played Texas Tech, and one almost lost and one blew Texas Tech out by over 50 points. So with that in mind, you have to put something in consideration. You have to put the simple fact that a SEC team, I'm sorry, an SEC team has to make the college football playoffs. It's not me being biased, but we all know that any SEC team, if it's Georgia, Alabama, they can beat any one of these teams. They're one of the best teams. If we just look at it, Georgia can beat all of these teams. Alabama, even with them being at 8, can beat all of these teams. They can beat all of these teams. The only team that I see them really even struggling with is Georgia. And that's not even me being my biased Alabama fan that I am. But the SEC is just different type of ball. It's a different type of animal. The competition level is different. The athletes, the talent that you have there, you have talent everywhere. But the talent and the skill gap is different. It's not like college basketball, how any team can win. No. If you have a good team, a very good team, versus a team with, for the most part, 2 to 3 stars, in football, you're going to win. The 5-star team is going to win. That's the reality of the situation. We've never seen a college football playoff without an SEC school. Never seen one with the SEC school. And I feel like it shouldn't change. It should be, okay, we know it's a deserving thing, but at the end of the day, it's the entertaining aspect to your audience. That's what it is too. Because we all knew that Georgia was going to beat TCU. And we don't want the same thing with Georgia versus Florida State. We don't want that. Or Georgia versus Washington. We don't want that. Yes, it's deserving, but what are you going to make it, committee? What are you going to make the college football playoffs? Are you going to make it the 4 best teams or the 4 most deserving teams? Because the 4 most deserving, I didn't even give y'all my list for the 4 most deserving. The 4 most deserving teams is Georgia, Michigan, Washington, and I would personally say Texas. I would say Texas is more deserving than Florida State. I just do. Because they're over Oregon because of the common team. So with that in mind, and I feel like they're better than Florida State, I just feel as though in the competition level, I feel as though Texas should be that team. Should be that team, that 4 team. But if we're going to list the best 4 teams, it's Georgia, Michigan, Texas, Alabama. That's the 4. Number 5, I will probably have to say Ohio State, 6, Oregon, and 7, I would say Florida State, and 8, Washington. That's how the list would go because we all know the competition level is way different. So with that in mind, this championship week can easily turn upside down, and it can be crazy for every one of these teams. None of these teams are at a lock right now. At any point in time, they could easily just lose to one of these teams. The only team that I feel as though, like I said, that is a lock is Iowa. Not Iowa, Michigan beating Iowa. But Iowa has a good defense, so who knows? But if Georgia beats Alabama, they're automatically in. I feel like if Alabama wins against Georgia, they should be in. I feel as though Florida State, even though if they do win, they're not a 4 best team. They're just not. So with that in mind, and you're going to have people that be like, well, you shouldn't penalize Florida State for winning. They're not a 4 best team. They're just not. You have to take somebody out, and especially if Texas win, there's going to be some movement. And if Alabama wins, there's going to be some movement. Needless to say, Ohio State is 100% out of it. I feel as though they should be 100% out of it because they're not playing nobody. Every single one of those teams are going to try and make the college football playoffs and win a championship. I feel as though after that game against Michigan and the fact that they lost 3 straight years, they should have dropped all the way behind Alabama because they're not playing for nothing. So let me know what y'all top 4 is going to be. Let me know who y'all think is going to win. Like I said, Alabama's beating Georgia. Michigan's beating Iowa. Oregon is going to beat Washington. And then I have Texas beating Oklahoma State. And my top 4 is going to be Georgia. No, not Georgia. My top 4 is going to be Michigan, Oregon, Texas, Alabama. If it goes the way that I want it to go. That's how I feel it should be. But let me know what y'all think. So with that in mind, that is the end of this podcast episode. If y'all made it to the end, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on them post notifications to get the latest updates on when I post a full Real Spill Wednesday or a full podcast episode. I'm going to try and get y'all 2 podcast episodes. I'm trying and get y'all that. So with that in mind, I love each and every one of y'all. And with that in mind, y'all have a nice rest of y'all night.